be able to come and share. Yeah, I'm excited. Actually, even preparing for this presentation reminded me what an amazing process it was 3 years ago. So yeah, my name is Angie Song. I'm an associate minister at Vaughan Community Church, just north of Toronto in Thornhill, which is a member of the Presbytery of Eastern Han-Ca. And in 2018, so 3 years ago, I had the privilege of working with Stephen Kwan and the Well Church Mississauga, who is on this call, as they were in the early stages of planting their church from the Presbytery side. And so the Well Church gathered for their first worship service on January 7th of 2018. And on July 8th of that same year, exactly 6 months later, I was preaching at the induction service of Reverend Stephen Kwan. And so today I was asked to consider the question, what did Stephen and the leaders at the Well Church do to make it easy for the presbyteries to work with them? But perhaps I could put it in these words: what contributed to the positive relationship between the church and the presbytery? And so for today, I'll just share a little bit about the process really briefly of what it looked like. And then some of the key factors that I've been able to deduce from a conversation I had with Stephen this past week, and as well, just thinking through some of the ways that we were able to walk through the whole process together. So a little bit about the presbytery process. In January of 2018, the Well Church began worship services in the building of Arundel Presbyterian Church on the first Sunday of that year. And then in the first presbytery of that year of March, the mission committee recommended to the presbytery that the Well Church Mississauga be given permission to be a member church of the Presbytery of Eastern Han-Ca. And then the second motion was that I be the interim moderator, and then also elect 2 assessor elders through the process. And so that was the month I began talking with friends, with interim ministers, but I realized some of the questions around church planting were really unique, that people didn't have answers to. So I got to meet Jen for the first time over the phone, as I called national office and spoke with Ian around polity and process and just the wisdom of what the next steps were. And then in April of that year, I got to gather in Stephen's basement where the leadership regularly met, along with an assessor elder, the church leaders. And we talked about everything from like church planting to leadership to Presbyterian polity and the church's responsibility to the denomination and the larger church and the presbytery, the schedule and process of induction, just defining membership, which is a big factor in this, and finances and so many other topics. It was quite a long evening meeting. And then later I wrote up the call papers, and we had our first congregational meeting by the end of that month after multiple meetings with the leaders. And unanimously, the congregation received Reverend Stephen Kwan as their minister of word and sacrament. And so in May of that year, the church was approved for presbytery grant. And then in June, there was an emergent meeting called of presbytery to consider the call papers, and they were accepted, as well as a service set for July 8th for his induction service. So it was 6 months of a whirlwind. It was a lot of learning, a steep learning curve for both Stephen, myself, the church, and the presbytery. It had been a while since our presbytery had planted a church. But there were, I think, some really key factors as to what made the relationship really positive between Stephen and the presbytery, the church, and all the other ministers and elders involved in the whole process. And so I thought I would just share those, and it's just really 5 things that I really sussed out. But the first factor that contributed to a positive relationship, I think, was really a clear and compelling vision. And this came from both sides. So Stephen was speaking to the Reverend Richard Kim, who is a member of our presbytery. And Richard was saying, the normal process that a lot of Korean immigrant churches happens is that they'll plant an English-speaking church because they have children who don't speak Korean. And so the English-speaking ministry will be one ministry within the larger church. But Richard had this vision to say, instead of just planting a ministry within this church, what if you planted a separate ministry, a whole other church, a church plant in itself, bringing together your young adult leaders that you already have who are passionately working with you to build a church, as well as the young adults and the youth in Richard's church, and come together. And so this was really a new kind of a vision that we hadn't really seen or considered in our presbytery. And that was the idea. They really wanted to start something new and put a possible way forward to give more freedom and responsibility to the next generation church. And I think on the presbytery side, there has always been a history of church planting. I think, to tell you the truth, Presbytery of Han-Ca, Eastern Han-Ca is almost itself kind of like a presbytery plant within the PCC. And so that spirit has continued on. And there have been churches that have decided to go to another city to be able to plant a church in that area because there was no church in that area servicing Korean immigrants. And in parallel to that, I think a lot of immigrants who come to Canada really do come for their family and their children's future. And so I think this really parallels that same story. I think another factor was that the church plant model or church plant idea was a familiar model. It's something that we as a presbytery understood and knew. But also I think there is something unique to the Korean culture. And I don't know if you've seen the show Kim's Convenience, but yeah, it's the story of my childhood. It's the story of many of our first and second generation immigrants to Canada. There is really an entrepreneurial spirit with small businesses and such. And so it wasn't a totally new idea when we think about church planting in the Korean presbytery. Secondly, when Stephen came to presbytery in March of that year, he came with such a clear and viable plan. And when I asked him last week, it's like, oh, did you do it because you were coming to presbytery? He said, no, we already had a plan because they wanted to be clear in their own vision as a church. So they didn't make a plan for the sake of presbytery, but they made it for the sake of their own leadership and their own ministry. It was so clear, it was so detailed. There was ministry structure and a plan in place. The vision was laid out. There was a leadership structure as well as ministry structure with leaders designated for each ministry, a budget for each ministry, down to the outreach events that they would do to care for each of their members and reach out to the larger community. Just as an example, I was looking through that budget today, and one of the examples was that they had budgeted $240 for baptism flowers at $20 for each bouquet, meaning that they had planned in their first year of ministry to baptize 12 people. And so that was to the detail that they had in their budget. And they had a financial plan to figure out how they would slowly move towards a self-sustaining ministry. And so it was clear that they had thought through their plan before coming to presbytery. Thirdly, they had a really committed leadership team, and I got to meet with them regularly through these 6 months. But it was so clear that Stephen wasn't going into this church plant on his own, that he had a really core committed group of young adults. And these young adults were literally 20 to mid-30s. They were passionate. They had a desire to grow. They were like hungry and asking all these questions about, oh, what do we do about pension? And what do we do about presbytery sharing? And all these questions that I don't know what other 20 to 30-year-old is really asking and taking on that responsibility, but they really had a sense that this is a responsibility of our church and we were taking it on, and they were willing to give an extraordinary amount of time and even finance towards making sure that the church plant continues. they had been, this is what I wrote this in my report to the presbytery, that they have been forward thinking and thoughtful in their leadership, asking questions about Presbyterian denominational requirements and accepting responsibility with joy. And really they were breaking ground to helping our presbytery see a new way of church planting as an option for English speaking ministries. Fourth, I think is really quite similar to this idea of a committed leadership team, but it was so clear in my time with Stephen and his team that they really had this sense of ownership and initiative. I could see that it was clear that he wasn't waiting for the presbytery to start his ministry, waiting for either permission or status or funds to do so. They just started. They hoped for the church's support, and they had started worshiping before even coming to presbytery. They were working out of his basement. Stefan, I don't know if you want people to know this, but he was even working at Starbucks at that time to make ends meet. And his family, everyone in his family was doing what they needed to make this church plant happen. Same thing with the leaders. They were taking on this financial burden and giving everything that they could and they had to make this happen. And so it was really exciting to communicate this back to the presbytery. And there was such an energy and a joy in the presbytery to hear such commitment into wanting to church plant and reach new communities with the gospel. And lastly, there was this, I think the undergirding thing was there was a relational trust between Stephen and the presbytery. Stephen was a member already on the presbytery's appendix to the roll. He grew up in the Presbyterian church, and so there were elders and ministers in our presbytery who could just vouch for him as a follower of Christ, as well as vouch for his calling and gift to ministry and to the church. Stephen himself is just excellent at building ministries, and he is really intentional about that and goes out of his way to make sure that happens. And so I think on both sides of the church and the presbytery, there was a trust that was built over a long time. It wasn't a short process, even though it was a 6-month quick process. I think there's a long, slow work that was happening over years leading up to this to help make this experience such a positive, positive experience for both the church and for the presbytery and for pastor alike. And so that's a little bit of my thoughts of what was so helpful for us on the presbytery side to be able to work with Stephen and his leadership team and his church in the church planting process.